Imagine this all wasn't here at one point, or if it was, it didn't look exactly like this. But the land rolls up here, the land rolls up over there, and somewhere's around here was the big circus tent. Somewhere's around here was the siding with the 6 tank cars for the fresh water. Somewhere's around here there were podiums for speeches and whatnot, and of course people running around. You can imagine horse buggies. Now, of course, the interstate wasn't here. This was probably all just land. None of this was here. But we're getting ready to go take a tour around this area. But the Katy rail line was off that way. And the historic photo is taken from this side, looking that way, looking dead east. All right. Any questions, Bill? Any questions from you?
Yeah, where the railroad line is right now, it seems like we're still a significant ways away from that rail line, maybe a quarter mile. I mean, we're several hundred yards, 1,000 feet away.
That's correct. It's about a quarter mile away. It's about a 0.3 mile away from where we're at right here, where the rail line. But we're going to go. We're going to go up here to Wiggins, take a right. We're going to be on the north end. As we cross the tracks, look north, look south. You'll see how the rail line rolls north, up high, and if you look south, you'll see how it rolls up. So both these locomotives were pushed back on these high points, and they came down into the valley for the wreck. And again, we're on a modern interstate freeway. This is our vantage point. But back then, we would be a lot closer if you want to see the rail side.
See you, radio.
Rail line. This is now the Union Pacific Rail line. This was the Katy rail line. And if you look to your left, you'll see how the grade goes north. If you look to your right, you'll see how the grade goes up to your right. The collision point is further south from us.
Copy.
See how it goes up that way? Yeah. It goes up the hill that way, and then it kind of goes up the hill that way. The actual collision bang, I haven't been able to verify its
stage train wrecks. The media and others like to fall back to ancient Roman metaphor, and so the 2 trains that were to crash into each other were often referred to as iron gladiators, or in some cases iron monsters. Well, they didn't want to just use any old railroad locomotive. So they did want to use one that they didn't need anymore, obviously, because they were going to destroy it. So they took a couple of steam engines that dated from the early 1870s. So they were obsolete anyway, but they were still sitting around the shops at Denison. And so the yard crews dressed up the trains, took out unnecessary equipment, doctored them up a little bit so that when the time came, they could jam the throttle and jump out. The coolest thing, I think, and this is stolen from Streeter, Crush had one of the engines painted red, and just so you can imagine what a red engine looks like, here's a red engine right here, painted by Beverly, thank you. So, and then the other engine was painted green, and so they, and each one had 3 box cars behind it with laden down with railroad ties to keep them more sturdy. Well, Crush wasn't through yet. He was a classic example of somebody who not only thought outside of the box, he thought outside of the boxcar, because it dawned on him that he could have train crews stretch canvas on the side of these wooden boxcars, and then they could sell advertising to be painted on the side of the boxcar. So, it does not look like he missed anything in planning this event. Well, one of the next things he did was to hire another delightful character. And I was talking about the railroad hierarchy. This is from a Katy Railroad magazine, a little bit later than the 1890s, obviously. But the character on the left is obviously the engineer of the train, and the guy on the right looking at his watch is the conductor. So here's an example of one of the tickets that they sold. The price varied from destination to or launching point to to city. This is one that would be a round trip ticket from Dallas to down to Crush. Interestingly enough, nobody ever bothered to even do a drawing of what Crush, Texas looked like. This is just a railroad, kind of a typical railroad facility, and it might have been somewhat reminiscent of that, but you have to really kind of use your imagination in terms of what Crush, Texas looked like. The locomotives the iron monsters were similar to these early 1870 models with the distinctive diamond stack on the top of them. This is when they were getting ready for the, shows an example of a fireman stoking up the ovens as they were building steam to crash each other. Anyway, Crush hired this fellow by the name of Jervis Dean, who was a professional photographer here in Waco. And shadow catcher is an early generic term for those who made their living taking pictures. He looks kind of like your, I guess, average 1890s sort of guy in that picture, but a lot of things that were unusual about him. For one thing, he came from a family, all of photographers. All of his siblings, all of his brothers were also professional photographers, and he was the youngest, and he just kind of moved up in the business. I think he had a sense of humor. It looks like he was a pretty good photographer, all of which is important for later on. Another character, much lesser known, that Crush hired was an interesting man by the name of Enoch Rector. He came from New York, and he was associated with Edison's very early efforts in New York to develop movies. And so Crush hired him to make a film of the crash at Crush. And to do that, it was not a simple little matter like taking a GoPro today and shooting it. Literally, he built a large wooden box that, as you can see, was large enough to stand up in, and basically that was the camera. And he was inside that, and they had that box there at the crash site. Well, not only were there no pictures taken of of what Crush looked like at the time, there were very few pictures taken prior to the crash. There are 4 famous images, which I'll get to in a minute. I think there may have been a 5th one that got lost. This is from a magazine article, the very first magazine article that was published after the crash. And it's a drawing, but it looks to me like a tricked up photograph or one that's based on a photograph. So I think that may have been kind of what the scene looked like beforehand. Well, Dean set up his cameras. Crush had a press stand built, as you can see, relatively close to the main line where the crash would occur. So this is the first image that Crush took, that Dean took. And as far as I know, even though he and his brothers went on to sell these pictures, I believe that there are only 2 known copies, both of which are at the Texas collection. When they got their second copy, it was a better print and better quality, and so they have since digitized these images, and they're much better now, and I was able to use those for the book. The caption beneath it you can't see is, this is the moment when the 2 engines came close to each other. He called it shaking hands. They would be about a mile apart, so after this photograph was taken, the engines back up for a mile. And then Crush had also had a role in handpicking the train crews, and it was considered to be quite an honor to be involved in this. And of course, the railroad works on a seniority system, and that's how the crew was selected. There was one of the engineers who was more of a hot dog than the others. The plan was that when the train got up to about 10 miles an hour, they were supposed to bail out. And they did, except for one guy, and his crush looked on in horror. It looked like, for some reason, he had been impaired and not come out of the train and, might be killed. But at the last moment, literally at the last moment he could, he also bailed out. And it turned out he was just showboating. And I don't think that was planned by Crush. And Crush really, he was working hard. On the day of the crash, he was mounted on a white horse. He had a blue sash across his chest to signify that he was with the railroad. They'd hired 200 deputy constables commissioned them out of Waco primarily to police the crowd. And from the get-go, as people began to arrive and they were coming in from all over, they were getting too close to the tracks. And so Crush literally was riding around, yelling at people, threatening to delay the crash unless they moved back. So he really honestly tried, I think. Safety, I think, was on his mind, though there were certainly some mistakes made. This is the photograph that Dean took literally just milliseconds before the impact of the two trains. The few days before the crash, they had checked the speed, and it came in plus or minus about 50 miles an hour. Now, my mathematical skills are what made me become a journalist, but I do know that when you have one object moving 50 miles an hour and another object moving 50 miles an hour, when they come together, the equivalent energy is 100 miles an hour. And I've got a friend who's a retired math professor, and I gave him the problem. I said, is there any way you can calculate the force involved when the boilers blew? And he played around with it, and basically he came up with damn fast. It just damn bad. The boilers were under a lot of pressure because they were, they wanted the train to move as fast as possible. So it was quite a spectacular explosion. The estimates on the crowd, like today, vary wildly. I've seen as low as 20,000, as high as 50,000. I kind of think, let's subtract 80% or so, or 20%, let's make it about 40,000. There was no hard head count. If Katie ever knew how many tickets they sold, that record has not survived. But there were a lot of people there. And in fact, I point out in the book, on that one day, which incidentally was September 15th, 1896, Crush, Texas, was the largest city in Texas. It was bigger than Dallas, it was bigger than San Antonio, it was bigger than Houston. That many people showed up for this event. Well, this is an artist version that hangs in the library at the Texas Collection, kind of an imagined example of what it looks like. But this is what it really looked like. This was when the explosion occurred, and obviously Dean, film speed was not that great in 1896, and so I suspect that he was tripping the shutter at that moment anyway. The problem is nobody expected that to happen. They thought that the same thing that happened in Columbus would happen, which is that they would crash together and that would be it. One of the Katy engineers warned before this happened. He said, you know what, those boilers are going to blow. And the railroad thought about it a little bit and thought, nah, that's not likely to happen, or that's not going to happen. And went ahead with it. Obviously, OSHA did not exist in 1896, or we would not even have it. This is a shot that was taken immediately after the crash, showing the people gathering between the boxcars where the wreckage of the train is. The people just, ignored the barricades. They rushed into the crowd, and the crowd rushed in and they started collecting souvenirs. The problem is, when those two boilers exploded, it sent shrapnel out into 40,000 people.
Oh.
And among those, amazingly, only only 2 people were killed outright. A third person died in an incident that was certainly because of the crash. He probably had become overserved of alcoholic beverages there during the day as they waited for the train crash. And so as the trains were leaving to take everybody back to their destination, he was walking between one car and another car and unfortunately slipped and fell and was run over by the train.
Oh, wow.
So he was a third fatality that's directly related to the crash. 6 other people were injured, including Jervis Dean, who was injured so badly that they thought he was going to die. Crush immediately took charge, and there were several doctors in the crowd, so they came up to Dean, shot him up with morphine because he was in a lot of pain, and then put him and all the other injured people onto the first Katy train out of the site, and they went to the Katy Depot here in Waco, unloaded there, and then by buggy or hack, they took them from there to the old Pacific Hotel in downtown Waco. Of course, it's long since been torn down. But actually, that was Waco's first hospital. Most of the prominent doctors in town, let's see if I'm going to do it. Most of the prominent doctors in town had their rental office or rented offices here on the first floor. And then the norm of the day was if somebody needed surgery or needed medical care, they got a room at the hotel there. And the doctor, could just go up the stairs and attend to them. That's what they did with these injured people. Later on, Waco, as you probably know, was a pretty substantial town at that time. Had some really good doctors, and there was a young surgeon who operated on Dean. Something had gone into his eye, or at least his eye had been penetrated. And as the guy got into his eye, he discovered a 2-inch long bolt that actually went through his eye and partially penetrated through the back of the eye into Dean's brain. And just think, this is 1896. That surgeon successfully removed that bolt from the eye. Obviously, he lost that eye, but he saved his life. I mean, pretty advanced medical care for that era. I mean, even today, somebody with a penetrating brain injury is not likely to be in good shape. So then they sent in crews to clear the debris from the track. It took until about 9 o'clock before they got things organized. And the crash happened plus or minus at 5 o'clock that afternoon. And it took about 4 hours to get everybody organized and back on the train. It was pretty chaotic. That was the only thing that Crush did not estimate well, was the chaos of trying to get out of there. Then they had steam cranes there that were on standby. They got the track cleared, and then the plush and famous Katy Flyer, which was their fast passenger train, was only 20 minutes late because it was headed down the main line and had to wait a little bit for them to get the tracks cleared, but still, it was only 20 minutes late. Now, humor obviously helps when you're dealing with any kind of adverse situation. You can see the ad that he ran there, and that was only a month or so, month and a half after his surgery. He went back to business. He was his perspective may have been a little bit off because he only had one eye, but he continued as a photographer here in Waco, and later left Waco. His wife divorced him. And I've never found any indication that there was any brain, any impact on his brain in a mental health sense. But you would have to think it's possible, and that may have been what led to the discord. Because before that, there certainly was no indication that he had any trouble in his marriage. These are the parents of one of the people that were killed. There was a young man killed named Ernest Darnell, and then there was a young lady killed whose name was Emma Overstreet. These are her parents, and they were pretty old at the time. Both of them, if you might imagine, died hard from the flying debris. Well, very soon after the fact, the one thing that hasn't changed is that litigation always follows injury, and the Overstreets filed a lawsuit against the Katy Railroad, and they prayed for a lot, and the Katy answered basically. I love their responses. They basically said in a legally sort of way, what Katy Railroad? And then in the next paragraph, they said, what crash? Like what? These may have been some off-duty Katy personnel, but they were, it was pretty sleazy the way they were trying to get out of it. At some point, I don't know if it was Crush, somebody came to their senses and realized that they did not need that trial to go to court, and they eventually settled it. I'll get into a little bit more of that in a minute. This is the grave of Ernest Darnell, and he was the only son, and his father had that huge marker put up. The father didn't much outlive him, and that's the father's marker, that shorter marker right next to it. And the big marker really almost amounts to a public and permanent shaming of the Katy Railroad, because it says on there, in so many words, that his beloved son died while watching the crash at Crush. Well, enter Scott Joplin. We don't know if Scott Joplin was there at the time. A real good friend of his was a black porter, Pullman porter for the Katy Railroad. This was the talk of the railroad world before it happened. So there's no record that totally confirms that Joplin saw the crash, but he dang sure heard about it from people. And it is known that he was in Temple at the time, so it's very plausible that he went to the crash. And so he published a piece of music. He composed a piece of music, which was sort of the beginning of his career. And we'll see now how well I remember how to go to the sound. And okay, good. No, all right, I shouldn't be doing this. No, that's the right, that's the entertainment. No, that's the video of the, let's just try clicking on the link on the slide. Yeah. Sorry for the technical issue.
It's all right.
You can actually the whole
of you with a better musical ear than I have can tell that really the genius of his compositional abilities is beginning to show. This is pretty early in his career, but the music that he was producing basically was musically reproducing the crash of those two trains, and you can hear the bells ringing, and you hear one that seems a little bit closer than the other one, and really pretty artful. This sheet music was published in Temple. And there's one theory that maybe Crush also hired him, because you notice up there it says dedicated to the MK&T Railroad. And maybe because he was black, Crush didn't own up to it, since we were right in the middle of the Jim Crow era. But he surpassed that, and it was two white music store owners in Temple who published this piece of music. So, you know, we had the racism on one hand, but on the other hand, we have a little bit of a progressive attitude. So let's get out of this now. So one last character to talk about, and that is Head-On Joe Connolly. There's a legend that maybe he was in the crowd and saw the crash at Crush, but that's pretty much discounted. But he's from Iowa, and he became a professional train crasher. Streeter by this time had quit. The Katy Railroad never did it again. But Head-On Joe started staging these things all over the country at county fairs, at state fairs, and he did it from 1896 until 1932. He did his last one in 1932, and he did more of them in Texas than any other state. So the folks in the West like to brag, and others have said that, you know, hey, this was a one-of-its-kind event in West, and about all that can really truthfully be said is that it was an early event in the train crashing business. But Head-On Joe was quite the character. So far as I've been able to tell, nobody was ever harmed on his watch when he staged the train wreck. So, and we'll get to more about him too in that. This is a photograph of two of his trains that he had staged at the moment of their crash. And here, assuming that I'm able to do this, is this was done in 1913. It's obviously silent, but this was done only 17 years after the crash at Crush. And so I think it can give you a sense of what it may have looked like at Crush. This was in California.
Whoa. Boom.
Oh,
Where's the explosion?
they got lucky.
Well, the cylinder's ruptured, that's for sure.
That lousy image I have of Head-On Joe is, again, the only one I could find. For a guy who was such a promoter, I can't imagine he was never photographed. Boy, if he was, I dragged the nets pretty deep and could never find one. That said, you'll see in a minute a guy, there'll be a shot of two men, and the one on the right when he comes up possibly might be Head-On Joe. I mean, he kind of acts, yeah, that guy right there on the right, kind of acts like he might have had a dog in the hunt, so to speak.
Cool.
Technological evolution and the gig economy is changing the nature.
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the book's backstory. First of all, a heck of a lot of research went into it. The other day, just for this, I piled everything up on a table. All of those notebooks, those 2 notebooks are probably 4 inches thick of material. That is nowhere near as all the books I looked at, because I've given away some of them since then. Found scores of various images to pick from to illustrate the book. So a lot of research went into it. But it needs to be attributed to Miss Martine Holbrook. Miss Martine Holbrook was my 7th grade homeroom teacher back when dinosaurs still tread the hills west of Boston. And she taught us Texas history. And I was already into Texas history at that point. But she had us keep scrapbooks, an archaic method of teaching. I'm sure it doesn't exist anymore. So on September 16th, 1962, I saw that article in the Austin American Statesman and clipped it out for my class. And I kept that clip. I mean, that is the original clip that caused me to first learn about the crash at Crush. Now, over the years after that, you know, a lot of other writers have written about Crush. As I looked at those articles doing the research, I could see that they were all derivative. There was an interview of a major figure in it in 1936, and then there was another recollection by one of the train crew members in 1957. And then from that, all the other authors just, you know, basically, plagiarize not too strong, it's too strong a word, but their article is derived from these other articles. So in about 2016, my editor at Arcadia Press, which is based in Charleston, South Carolina, said, Mike, would you like to do a book on the crash and crush? And, you know, I knew what it was, and for some reason that I can't tell you, it didn't seem like something I wanted to do. And so I said, nah, I think I'll pass on that. I said, but I got a buddy, an old newspaper friend of mine. He's never written a book, but he's a good writer, and would you be interested in having him do it? And he said, oh, okay, sure. So I contacted my bosom buddy. I mean, we've known each other since the early 70s. And he said, okay, yeah, cool, I'll do the book. So I turned on to other pursuits. Well, about, I don't know, 2 or 3 months later, I thought, you know, I haven't heard from Larry how he's doing on that book. And so I called him and I said, hey, what's up with the book? Have you got a contract signed? He said, no, I decided not to do it. And I said, why? And he said, well, I just think it would be too much work. So challenged by that, I thought, well, what the heck, I'll do it. So, and I'm really glad I did, because it's really a great story, and I hope that I've shown in my book that there's a lot more to the story than the bare outline that I told you, and also the commonly told story. And I did find a lot more detail than I even expected to. And I had to read a lot about train travel. And I'll tell you what, I fell in love with an era that I'm just barely old enough to be on the cusp of. I mean, you know, the passenger service continued in one way or the other in Texas until, you know, the early to mid 1960s. The very last passenger train was the Texas Eagle, run by the Missouri Pacific, and I rode that last train at that time as a newspaper reporter to do a story on it. But it was a cool era. The more I read about it, I mean, you know, they did mostly run the trains on time as opposed to the airlines, and you know, you could just carry anything on the train you wanted to. You didn't have to walk through a metal detector, blah 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 blah. Now, that said, you know, we do have Amtrak, and a couple or so years ago, and somehow I missed the news coverage of this, it used to be that Amtrak passed through Austin, I think twice a week on their Chicago to San Antonio run. But they've since gone daily, and that train goes through McGregor every day, both ways. Why in the world they opted to go through McGregor than Waco, which is only 18 miles away? Again, that's some nuance of the railroad business that I don't understand. But I spent a lot of time at the old Katy Depot in Denison, which has been turned into a Katy Museum. At the museum in West, which has a very good display on the crash. They have the only known artifact from the crash. It's a round metal donut-shaped object that nobody's been able to identify, but it was plowed up in the field where the crash occurred. And also I got the just killer story that I was able to use as the prologue to start my book with. And that is that Hay came in and they leased land on either side of the right-of-way, to put their customers on when they came to see the crash. And they were just farm families. Well, this was the talk of the whole area, of course, all of Central Texas, as they were building this facility. And the one farmer had two girls and a young boy. And when the day of the crash came, the father went to see the crash, and the two older sisters were left in the house to watch the little boy. The father had pronounced that it would be way too dangerous for them to be allowed to see the crash. Well, as soon as the father left, the little boy waited until his sisters weren't looking. He slipped out of the house, went into their hay barn, climbed up to the second level, and was able to look through the door there of the hay barn, and had a perfect bird's eye view of the track. And so he got to see the whole thing. And this story was told to me by his still living granddaughter there in West. Well, the kicker is that he saw the explosion, and boy, what a show that was. And then he stood up to sneak his way back into the house. Well, his mother had been standing behind him the whole time. He had seen him leave. Anyway, I visited the graves of the victims. I went to the wonderful McLennan County Archives, and I think I'm probably the first person to hold the two lawsuits that were filed in their hands, probably since 1896 when they were settled. The archivist there, it took a little bit of hunting to look them up, but we found the actual paperwork, which had a lot more detail in it than I had thought. Also, the docket books for the Justice of the Peace for the West area were still around, and so I was able to see how many people had been arrested for drunk and that sort of thing. They had 200 special officers there, and you would have thought there would have been just scores of arrests, because like I say, they were out there all day before the crash occurred, but they were just a handful. It was really pretty impressive. Also, thanks to newspapers.com. If any of you do research, I caution you that it ought to be a controlled substance, because when you start looking on these digitized newspapers that you can search, I can just look up and maybe 3 hours later, I'm totally lost in it. Well, and any of you here who do aspire to write a book, I want to share with you 3 things that I guarantee will happen to you if you write a book, because they have happened to me on many occasions. Number 1, no matter how many times you have read your manuscript and you have read the page proofs, no matter how many times your wife's read them, or your significant others read them, or your friends read them, or your editors read them, when the book is published and when you open it up for the very first time, you will find a typo. Now, I'm happy to say that so far, so good on the Crush book. I have not found a typo. The next thing that happens is that as you're looking at your book, you will suddenly remember something that you intended to put in it that was really cool, and you just flat forgot it. That's happened to me. And it happened to me in this book. And number 3, you'll learn something really neat about your subject matter that you didn't even know at the time, that you sure wish you could have put in the book if you'd known it. Well, so whatever happened to, let me get past Mrs. Holbrook here. Yeah, okay. Whatever happened to these folks? Well, again, Alfred Streeter. What a character he was. He left the professional train crashing business, made a little money, not a whole lot. But, as I said, he'd been a brakeman for the railroad, and he had a notion of how to build a better mousetrap, or as it were, a better brake component. Chicago was the industrial center for the railroad industry at that time. The Pullman cars were made there. And so he got a patent on an improved railroad brake device It sold very well. He ended up getting, I think, something like 8 or 9 patents and became a millionaire. I mean, a big-time Chicago millionaire. And life was great. You know, he was happily with a woman, and you know, the future was completely rosy, except for one night. The Chicago Police Department raided a sleazy hotel in downtown Chicago, and in that hotel, which was known as a place of illicit rendezvous, shall we say, in one of the rooms they found a 17-year-old girl who was Streeter's lover, and they found that he was paying for her piano lessons. She had a closet full of really fine clothing. And to top it all off, the police found a bunch of love letters from Streeter to her. So basically, case closed on a statutory rape rap for Streeter. Well, obviously, because he was a millionaire and fairly well known in the town, the newspapers relished the story. And Streeter got indicted for the Illinois equivalent of statutory rape. And at about that time, he decided that it would be a great time to think about protesting in Canada, which did not at that time have an extradition treaty with the United States. So he hooked it to Canada. Well, as the media started digging and as the police started digging, they discovered that the woman that he had represented as his wife was actually a common law wife, and that he had another wife in the Cleveland area with kids, and on top of that, he had another wife with kids. So he had 3 sort of 2 real wives, 1 common law wife, and 1 17-year-old illegal girlfriend. So that's 4. Well, he died in a mental institution. Before then, of course, his wife left him, everybody else left him, and obviously neither knew about the others, you know. He lost all of his fortune. He did still have enough money to get his lawyer to get the indictment quashed, and so he never had to do any time on it. Chicago was notoriously corrupt, and so I'm sure that some money changed hands to get that happen. But what about Billy Crush? The myth is that he was fired on the spot for in effect, killing 3 people through his brilliant PR stunt. But that's not true. It's absolutely just a myth. He did get a telegram early on that evening saying, get your, you know what, to St. Louis to meet with the president of the railroad. So as soon as he had cared for the injured people, he got on the fast train to Dallas, and then from there, the overnight train to St. Louis. Went into the president's office fully expecting to be fired, and the president said, hey, you know, good deal, go and send no more. You know, he was not fired. And he stayed with the Katy Railroad until the early 1940s. If he ever had any kind of remorse over having killed 3 people in the name of publicity, I never found any record of it. But he was dedicated to that railroad. He'd spent about a half century in the railroad business. This is him as an old man, about the time that he was retiring from the railroad. But and he had a real nice home in Highland Park in Dallas. It still stands. He lived there. He did so well that he had a black driver and a housekeeper on his staff, according to the 1930 census. Did quite well in Highland Park. And because he did live in Highland Park, he lobbied for the construction of a satellite depot for the Katy Railroad in Highland Park, ostensibly to cater to the students from SMU, but also for his convenience and the convenience of other wealthy Valleysites, so they wouldn't have to go all the way downtown to Union Station. Well, as long as he was able, every single day, the old William George Crush, went to that train station, sat on that bench, and watched the Katy Flyer come in and would greet the passengers as they got off. And died. He did that until shortly before his death. Quite a character. Well, Scott Joplin became, obviously, his career continued to grow. He wrote the Maple Leaf Rag, which is the ragtime composition that really got him famous. Like many great people, he only made it, he didn't live that long. He died of syphilis in 1917 in New York, but by that time he had a considerable body of work, including this little piece.